Hello and welcome to the first episode of this series where we will be talking about authentication and authorization in ASP.NET Core web applications using Razor Pages. So this series is, created for individuals who are already familiar with developing web apps in Visual Studio using .NET and ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core. The focus will be, mainly on implementing authentication and authorization using ASP.NET Core Identity in the context of web applications. So the reason why I am emphasizing this web application thing is that there is another playlist about implementing authentication and authorization in web APIs. I am going to put the link of that playlist in the description of these episodes as well. So if you're curious about implementing auth-related concepts in web APIs, that would be a perfect playlist to watch. So in this series, we are going to implement a lot of different concepts related to auth in the domain of an airline company using ASP.NET Core web applications coupled with Razor Pages. I have prepared the notes as always. I have Visual Studio running on my other desktop. I have created a blank solution called Skyline. I am going to add a web application to this solution. And we are going to study the notes. We are going to implement things, step by step. As for the audience, I assume you are already familiar with C#, with Visual Studio, with ASP.NET Core web apps, with Razor Pages, with, some object-oriented programming concepts. And above all, I assume that you are as motivated and curious as always to learn about, authentication and authorization. I am going to, explain everything related to authentication and authorization in full detail. But of course, I'm not going to explain other things because again, as I said, I assume you're already familiar with them. So as always, I have put the link to the repository of this project that we will be building in the description of each episode. You can click on that link. It'll take you to my GitHub page. You can clone the repository for each episode. We're going to create a branch so you can explore the code easily. And that's it. If you've got any, comments, if you've got anything to say, I'd be more than happy to get in touch with you guys. You just need to drop a comment in the comment section. So let's get started and see what we are going to build. This is the first episode of this series. As the title says, we are going to set up our project, our Razor Pages, our web app in Visual Studio, and we are going to design our domain. So the goals of this episode, again, is to set up our web application using Razor Pages. I am going to create another playlist for authentication and authorization in MVC-based applications, web applications. But in this series, I decided to go with Razor Pages. The concepts are not that different, by the way. I mean, if you understand auth-related stuff in Razor Pages, web apps, I think learning, authentication and authorization in MVC applications would be very easy. So we are going to talk a little bit about Razor Pages. We are going to scaffold our, application, and we're going to design our domain models. As I showed you, I have already created a single empty solution in Visual Studio. I am going to add, a project to this. So Skyline admin portal, I'm going to use .NET 8, and I am going to enable individual accounts under authentication type. And I am going to enable Razor pages and uncheck HTTPS for now. We are going to enable that later. So let's do this. I am going to create my project. So it's going to be, an MVC web app with Razor pages. I am going to call this a Skyline admin portal. I do not want HTTPS for now. .NET 8 is here. For authentication type, I'm going to use individual accounts. I do not want top-level statements. I have Razor pages enabled by default. Before I click on create, I want to talk a little bit about the different options that we set. So in ASP.NET Core, when you are setting up a new web app in Visual Studio, you're asked to choose an authentication type. There are different authentication types. As you have probably noticed, we've got non-individual accounts, Microsoft Identity Platform, and Windows. Let's talk a little bit about them because, as I said, the focus of this course is on authentication and authorization. So the first option is none, right? When you select none, it means you do not need any authentication whatsoever, at least for now. It means no user accounts, no login, logout functionality, no identity or authentication services, and it is ideal for public websites or API backends with no access control, or where auth will be added later. But because we are starting from scratch, it is a good idea to not choose none, because of course we're going to need authentication. Again, use cases, of course, sites that are going to be completely public, like brochure sites, static content, and microservices that rely on external authentication schemes and approaches, like, for example, an API gateway, which is out of scope for this series right now. The next option, the one that we chose, is individual accounts. It means that ASP.NET Core will add ASP.NET Core identity to your project. So using this framework, ASP.NET Core identity, you will have different authentication and authorization stuff built into your web app. Things like user registration, login, role management, password hashing, and so on. And you get built-in Razor pages inside of your application under a new, dedicated area called identity. I'm going to talk a little bit about areas, by the way, in this episode. And then you've got two storage options. You can use local DB or SQL Server as the database where the information about your users are going to get stored, or you can use to store the data in cloud. So, for example, use Azure SQL. Then some use cases. So of course, with individual accounts, the use cases are those websites where users will have the possibility to register or log in into the system. You want to have like admin dashboards, so like one portion or one some features of the application, let's put it this way, are only available to people of a certain role, for example, like administrators, or internal tools with role-based access, like, for example, different roles, admin, passenger, and then you want to, kind of create an internal application for these different roles. So let's talk a little bit more about, individual accounts with Microsoft Identity Platform. Right now, we are going to use individual accounts with Microsoft Identity. And this means that we will be able to integrate with Azure AD or Active Directory. We will be able to support logging with Microsoft accounts, work accounts, Microsoft Entra ID, and we will be able to use OpenID Connect under the hood. And then there are different roles. So we can use Microsoft Cloud Identity to manage access. This is great for enterprise web applications, for SaaS applications, or internal tools in Microsoft-based organizations. Use cases: corporate intranets, multi-tenant enterprise apps, applications that need single sign-on with Microsoft accounts. Again, if these seem to be a little bit overwhelming, no worries, because we're not going to focus on these for now. We just want to, get going with the project, implement authentication and authorization in our application, and these kind of deal with, let's say, more advanced stuff. which I will be probably covering in another playlist or maybe in the future episodes. Who knows? The next option, so we kind of talked about none, we talked about individual accounts. There is this Windows identity platform, and then there is Windows. Let's talk about those as well. So Windows authentication. This means that the user is going to be treated as the Windows user. So the user that has currently logged into the operating system. And there is no login UI when you choose Windows authentication, and users are authenticated by Windows automatically. Roles ideal for internal apps or on-premise applications in a Windows domain, and using this option you can enforce role-based access using Windows groups. Again, something that we do not want for now. Use cases: enterprise internet web apps, line of business apps used by employers in the same network, and environments that use AD, Active Directory. So as I showed you, we are going to use individual accounts for now. So let's create the app. I'm going to create the app and let Visual Studio scaffold my application. So this is my application. As you can see, I have this folder created for me, areas. And if I expand this, there is this folder called identity. And if I go to pages, I have this file called view start CSHTML. Again, one of the things that I am assuming for my audience in this course is that they are familiar with web applications in general developed by ASP.NET Core. I mean, with Razor Pages or MVC. And they want to focus on, authentication and authorization and stuff. If you know nothing about web apps, I think the course will be a little bit overwhelming for you, and I recommend taking a look at my other playlists on the channel. But if you are familiar with how, for example, Razor Pages work, what Razor syntax is, how MVC routing works, then you're fine. From time to time, I'm going to explain them, but not in detail. Then I've got the data folder. I've got the migration, application DB context model snapshot. I've got one application DB context, as you can see. And then I've got some pages here. And if I go to app settings, I've got one connection stream. So these are created automatically. And the reason is that I chose individual accounts for my project. Now let's go to the notes again to talk a little bit about these. So let's talk about the structure of our Razor Pages project. So when the application is created, as you saw, you've got this pages folder. So this contains the Razor Pages, like for example, CSHTML and CSHTML.cs files. Then you've got this area folder. And inside of that, you have identity. So this folder, this area, will contain the pre-built user interface pages, if you will, related to identity. Like, for example, the page that's going to handle login or register. And then there is this data folder, which right now includes the application DB context. So these are the things that are automatically created for us. So application DB context, it is not like a normal DB context. So if I go to this application DB context, it is not inheriting from DB context. It is inheriting from identity DB context. So here, not only you can kind of create DB sets for your domain models, like for example, flight and passenger, that we will be creating, but also this application DB context will be able to handle things related to authentication and authorization, like for example, users, roles, and so on. So that is the reason why we are inheriting from identity DB context, not DB context. So what is areas identity? In ASP.NET Core, as you might know, areas are like an approach or a way to organize large applications into feature-based sections. So different features in a web app, you are going to organize them using areas. So one area will probably contain things or features related to, let's say, administrative operations, like for example, creating flights, creating, bookings, and so on. So again, the areas help you to organize a large app into different areas, if you will, based on the different features that the application offers. So when you choose individual accounts as your authentication type during the project setup phase, ASP.NET Core is going to scaffold this area for you. I already showed you this, right? So you've got an identity area, you've got pages, and then there are other pages that we will be adding. So this is called Identity UI area. All the pages related to Microsoft Identity, things that will be kind of managing the authentication and authorization concepts or concerns of your app will reside in this identity area. So this is going to contain, different pages. For example, it's going to contain some Razor pages for some identity features. For example, we will be adding the login page. This page will contain the UI and logic for user login. Then we've got register page, which will contain the logic and UI for user registration. Then we've got logout. So logout, again, it's going to handle sign out. And then we've got manage folder. Manage will help us do things, related to managing users, like, for example, I don't know, password management, two-factor authentication, and things like that. And then you've got login partial, which is a partial view to show login or logout links. Now, let's continue talking about areas. Why are we using areas for our identity? So again, I told you areas allow you to organize a large app into separate, smaller, feature-based sections. So this helps with isolation because you are, separating the identity code from the business logic of your application. It is considered to be a convention, so it allows ASP.NET Core to discover and route to identity pages automatically. Things like login, logout, like register. Customization, of course, you can override the default UI that ASP.NET Core Identity provides. You are not limited. You're not forced to use the UI that is created by default by ASP.NET Core Identity. Of course, you can, customize them, and then it has a plug and play, approach. So if you don't touch it, it works fine. But if you need to change something, again, you can do. You can apply your changes. And of course, as an example for URL mapping, you know that inside of that area, we've got this folder called identity. And then there will be other folders, like, for example, account. And then there will be things like login, register, manage. And inside of our, application, we'll have different pages. So in the, for example, pages folder of our identity folder, we'll have a subfolder called account, and then we will have different, Razor pages. So based on the route that the user kind of, enters in the address bar of the browser, the application will get to one of these Razor pages and will start to use, that specific, Razor page. So this is kind of, the way URL mapping works out of the box based on the conventions that ASP.NET Core provides. And then, of course, we can use our anchor tags with our tag helpers to kind of link to those pages. For example, we can mention the area, which is identity, and then the page, account, login. So that'll take us to that login page inside of our ASP.NET Identity, area. I told you we can customize the UI that Identity provides out of the box. So even though you get, a very good starting point, you are not forced to use them. You can, kind of change or customize the UI of these pages, and we will be doing a lot of customization over the next few episodes. You can add custom fields, you can change the layout or branding, you can modify validation rules, and so on. But I do not want to explain things from the notes a lot. I want to get to the code. So let's do this. Let's model our domain. I want to create a folder called models, and then I want to create a couple of classes like flight and booking, because we are in the domain of an airline company, and we want to have our application user. And I am going to talk about application user when we create it. So the application user is the kind of type or class that will represent the user inside of our application, inside of this domain. So for example, we need to store the full name of our user. And as you can see, this application user is inheriting from identity user. So we are kind of creating a customized version of identity user. So identity user is the type that Microsoft Identity uses behind the scenes to represent a user. If you're fine with the different properties that identity user provides, then start using it. If you want to customize it, if for example you want an extra piece of data to store for that user, you can go ahead and create your customized application user. So let's go ahead and implement these classes. Inside of my project, I am going to create a models folder. So models. And then I am going to create my classes. So I am going to create a code file, and then I am going to add my flight class. If you want to learn more about clean architecture, domain modeling, you can use the courses and the playlists that I have on my channel. But in this series, we are not following clean architecture because that'll make the course very time consuming. We want to take things simple. So that's the reason why we are creating these, let's say, anemic domain entities. So this is the flight entity, then we'll have the booking. So the ID, the passenger name, email. For example, in terms of clean architecture, email needs to be implemented as a value object. Inside of that playlist that I have about clean architecture, I have done these. So email would be implemented as a separate value object, not a simple string. But again, for the sake of time, we are not doing these here. And then let's implement our application user. And this is the application user. Now I'm going to move these to their different and separate, code files. And then I am going to rename this code file to flight.cs. I want to talk specifically about this class, application user, why we are inheriting from identity user, what this identity user even mean. Let's go to the notes. So what is identity user? Identity user is a built-in class that ASP.NET Core Identity provides. This class represents the concept of a user or a user account in our application. So a user account has things like, email, password, username, and so on. So this user account type, this identity user, which is a built-in type in Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, already provides some properties, like for example, ID, username, email, password hash, phone number, security stamp, locked out, enabled, and so on. If these properties are enough for you, if you do not need any extra properties, just go ahead and use identity user. But if you think you need to store other pieces of data for your user, like for example, the full name, then you would have to create a customized version of this class. And in our case, we have done that. We have created application user, which inherits from identity user, which means that this class will contain those properties, and then it has a custom property as well. So why extend identity user? You extend it to store additional user data in your database and make it available through your app. And the next step would be to register our entities in our DB context. So this is the DB context. The DB context, as I showed you, is using identity DB context. And the type of the generic type parameter is going to be application user, so the class that we just created. And then we will have DB sets for our domain models, so for flight and for bookings. So let's get to the application. Let's go to application DB context. As you can see here, it is inheriting from identity DB context without any type parameters. I'm going to remove this, and I am going to write a new version of this class. So inheriting from identity DB context with this type parameter, application user, and then creating our DB sets. So these DB sets, flights, and bookings will be implemented as tables in our database. When we migrate the database, you will see that we get, flights, bookings, and then of course we will have our tables related to Microsoft to ASP.NET Core Identity. So what is Identity DB Context T user? T user is the application user. Identity DB Context is a special version of DB Context that comes from ASP.NET Core Identity. It adds different tables to your database for authentication. ASP.NET users, ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET user roles, ASP.NET user claims, and other, tables like ASP.NET logins, tokens, and so on. So these tables are going to be created automatically for you when you migrate the database. So, and these tables, automatically map your custom user class, application user, to those tables. So when you inherit from this type, Identity DB Context application user, you're basically saying, you know what, I've got a DB context. This DB context will include the DB set for my, domain models, flight and bookings, but it will also include all identity tables. And the, mapping will be done thanks to, NT framework for you. So that is the reason why we are inheriting not from DB context, like other, let's say DB context that you have probably developed, but from identity DB context. Why are we adding DB set flight and DB set booking? So because you also want to have your DB sets, right, in the same context class. So you are, controlling your domain models through this same DB context. Flight and booking are two of our domain models. So they will become tables in our database, and the same DB context will handle not only our domain models, but also things related to authentication and authorization. Now let's take a look at the Program.cs file to see what is the code there. So this is the Program.cs. Let's go through the code. Let me, I'm not going to close this altogether, but the code is, very self-explanatory. Basically, we are reading the connection string from our app settings file. We are adding the DB context that we just created, application DB context. We are using use SQL Server, right? So SQL Server will be our RDBMS, where we will be storing, our tables. And then we are going to add the database developer page exception filter. And then, as you can see here, we are adding default identity. I'm going to talk about these, by the way. I'm adding identity user for now. I'm going to change this. And then sign-in required confirmation account is set to true. I'm going to add, add NT framework storage and so on. And then razor pages. This block of code is added to the Program.cs for us automatically. Again, why? Because we chose individual accounts as our authentication type. Let's talk about this code. So the first, portion of the code is the place where we are reading the, connection string from our Program.cs, from our app settings file. So inside of our app settings file, this connection string has been automatically generated based on our, server and the name of the database. Of course, we can change the name as if we want. This is the connection string. So the default connection, of course, is the key. It retrieves the actual database connection string, and then if it is missing, this operator is going to throw an exception. So this helps prevent silently failing misconfiguration. The next section is registering our DB context, so our application DB context that we just discussed. So this registers your custom application DB context with our DI container. It says use this context, and when needed, connect to a SQL Server database using the provided connection string. So again, we are using use SQL Server, and the connection string that we got from our app settings file is going to be used inside of this method. So this configures Anti-Framework Core to use SQL Server as the database provider. This is required for features like migrations, data setting, and so on. The next step is to add a database developer page exception filter. So this is only for development. It adds a special detailed error page for EF core related exceptions. If the database, produces an error, like for example, invalid query, migration failure, you will get a full stack trace and details in the browser. And of course, that'll help you to diagnose the issue and fix your errors. So it is very useful for debugging things like, for example, table not found, cannot insert null into column, foreign key violations, and so on. In production, this page is not shown. How are you going to control the production and the development environments? Again, using environment-based configuration. I have a playlist on that topic. Environment-based configuration. It is a very interesting, topic, and I highly recommend that you take a look at the playlist. So let's continue. The next part is this section. Add default identity user, right? Of course, we need to change this. And then sign-in required confirmed, and then the add NT framework stores application DB context. First, let's talk about this section. Add default identity with the type of your identity user. This has changed. For us right now, it is application user. So this line registers and configures ASP.NET Core identity for your application. Add default identity user as the default identity system with registration, login, logout, password hashing, and other related, operations and features. Identity user is the default built-in user type. You can, of course, replace that with your, application user, the application user that we just created. The next step is setting some options. For example, we have set these options: sign-in, require confirmed account, true. What does that mean? This sets a configuration options. So require confirmed account true means users, after they register, they must confirm their email address before they can sign into their accounts. After registering, they will receive a confirmation email. They won't be able to log in until they click on that confirmation link. And this improves security by preventing fake or mistyped email from being used. And of course, there are other options that you can set. So like require digit, require non-alphanumeric for the password to kind of, require your users to enter strong passwords. And then the last part is add entity framework stores application DB context is the type of the DB context we just created. So this tells ASP.NET Core identity to use your application DB context to store and load users, roles, and identity data. This is how your database gets connected to Microsoft Identity, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. So this enables tables like ASP.NET users, ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET user roles, and so on. And of course, we should replace identity user here with our application user. So let's do that. Here, we are using identity user. I'm gonna, change that to application user. Application user. This is, the kind of type, the custom type that we have right now instead of, that identity user that comes built in with Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. The next step would be to apply our migrations. So we're going to apply the initial migration. We're going to update the database so that the database gets created. Again, if you take a look at the app settings file, you get the database name that is going to be created for you. So ASP.NET Skyline admin portal, and then like a grid, like an ID for the database. So let's go ahead and add the migration. So I'm going to create the migration. We change the type of the user, therefore, the application user, therefore, we need to add our migration. As you can see, we are going to add a new column called full name. So that is like the data, the new piece of data that we want to get stored for our users. And of course, we have two domain models, right? Flights and bookings. So we need to, add the migration, and then the next step, of course, would be to apply that migration using update database. So the database is created. Let's get to SQL Server Explorer, SQL Server Object Explorer. I'm going to pin this window, and inside of my local DB, my database says this is the database. Let me take a look at the app settings file one more time. The ID, this is the database we just created. This comes from the the other this database comes from the preparation of this series. So I've been preparing this series with notes and with a sample project. So this database comes from that, but the one above it is the one that just got created. So if I go to the tables, I can see the different tables related to Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity, and I can see my two tables here as well. Of course, if I go, for example, to ASP.NET users, I will not see any users, as you can see here, because we haven't created any users. We haven't kind of generated any seed data for the database now. We do not have any roles, we do not have any users, but that will change. The thing right now is that we have created the database and we have scaffolded the project. Now let's go to the next part. So we kind of created the identity tables and the two tables, flights and bookings. So let's test it. You land on the home page if you run the application, and you can check the identity account register to log in and see if it works or not. So let's do that. So I'm going to run the application now. Wait for it to come up. And as you can see, I got this exception, and it is, talking about this identity user, the fact that identity user is kind of not recognized here. So the issue is that, again, as I told you, we need to update our application and use application user, not identity user. We already did this in Program.cs, and we also need to do this in login partial. So here, if you take a look, this page is using identity user. So I'm going to change this to application user, and of course we need to import this namespace. We're going to change this to application user as well. And if you remember, the application user requires this full name, right? But as of now, when we want to register a user, there is no way for us to enter the username of our user, the full name of our user. So for example, if I go to my app again and try to create a new user with registering, first off, just notice that the pages are working. So this is the ASP.NET Core at work, ASP.NET Core Identity at work. But if I go and register a new user with some strong password, I will get an error because the database wants the full name of the user, and that table, the ASP.NET users, isn't allowing null values for this column. So this means that we need to update the user interface of this page to accept the full name of the user as well. Before doing that, we will do that in future episodes. Before doing that, you can seed the database. So you can create some roles and some users in the database, and then log in using those credentials so that you can kind of let's say test the different parts of the application with those users that you have seeded to the database. And that is something that we will take care of in the next episode. Now, We tested this, so the pages are working, but we cannot create a new user because of that full name thing. But in the next episode, we will see the database. And that was it. That was it for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If that's the case, continue watching the next episode as well. Consider subscribing to the channel, sharing the video, and giving this a like. I'll see you in the next one.